All right, let's jump right into this explainer on a true titan of 20th century literature. Today we're unpacking Samuel Beckett's 1953 masterpiece, Waiting for Godot. This is absolutely a foundational piece of modern drama. Originally written in French, it literally changed the entire landscape of literature. It's famous, or, maybe infamous, because it's a story where the act of waiting itself is actually the plot. There's no traditional narrative arc here, no neat little resolution, and honestly, no logical dialogue. Instead, we're handed this profound, raw meditation on human existence, suffering, and existential uncertainty. It's a work that forces us to examine the very nature of why we even persist.
But before we unpack all the profound meaninglessness woven throughout this play, we kind of have to pause and ask ourselves a pretty heavy question. What are you waiting for? Really, think about it for a second. In our own lives, we're constantly holding out for something, aren't we? We wait for success to finally show up, wait for love, maybe a sense of salvation, or honestly, just some concrete answers to our day-to-day problems. Well, Beckett takes this incredibly universal human experience of waiting for that one thing we believe will complete us, and he puts it right under a microscope. He asks the really tough question, what does it actually mean to keep holding out for something that realistically might never arrive?
And that brings us to the remarkably minimal premise of the story. Two men, one tree, a lifetime of waiting. The setting here is deliberately, intensely vague. We're just placed on this nondescript country road next to a single, lonely tree at evening time. And that's pretty much the whole shebang. It feels totally empty and timeless, like it could literally be nowhere and everywhere all at once. On the surface, very little actually happens. These two men, Vladimir and Estragon, they just stand beside this tree and they wait for someone named Godot. They talk, they argue, they joke around, they remember things, they forget things. And spoiler alert, Godot never arrives. This incredibly sparse setup perfectly mirrors the existential emptiness of the human condition, making it this massive universal symbol for all of human life. To really grasp why Waiting for Godot shook the literary world to its core, we have to understand the genre it helped invent, the theater of the absurd. So emerging right after the total devastation of World War II, this movement rejected basically everything audiences expected from a stage play. Out the window went clear motivations, realistic dialogue, and those neat, conventional happy endings. Instead, the theater of the absurd leaned hard into the absolute senselessness of the human condition. It completely paved the way for future legendary playwrights, guys like Harold Pinter and Tom Stoppard, proving once and for all that you don't actually need a traditional plot to capture the absolute core of the human experience. Okay, let's move on to Section 1, Mind, Body, and Power, where we'll take a look at the characters. What's fascinating is how we can view our central figures not just as two isolated guys hanging out, but almost as fragmented pieces of the human psyche itself. Take Vladimir, or Diddy, he's the intellect. He's thoughtful, he's reflective, he's obsessed with memory, and he's constantly trying to keep hope alive through all this spiritual questioning. He essentially represents human reason and consciousness. But then you have Estragon, or Gogo. He is entirely focused on the physical body. He's forgetful, he's impulsive, he's exhausted, and he is just hyper-focused on immediate physical discomfort, like constantly struggling to rip off his tight boots. This brilliantly illustrates the duality of humanity. Vladimir's philosophical mind and Estragon's physical suffering function almost like two halves of one dependent human being. They totally complete each other. Vladimir needs Estragon, Estragon needs Vladimir. It shows that we survive through our relationships, even the deeply dysfunctional ones. This whole duality thing continues with our second pair of characters, Pazzo and his servant, Lucky. Pazzo represents this domineering, arrogant authority. He embodies oppressive power, quite literally controlling Lucky by tying him up with a rope. On the flip side, we have Lucky, who represents blind obedience and total dehumanization. He's treated basically like a pack animal, lugging around Pazzo's heavy bags and a stool. And his name, Lucky, is deeply, painfully ironic. When Pazzo cruelly orders Lucky to think in Act 1, Lucky delivers this chaotic, nonsensical monologue. It's just a flood of broken philosophy, religion, and science that perfectly dramatizes the total collapse of rational meaning in this completely absurd world.
Next up is Section 2, The Illusion of Time, focusing on cyclical existence.
So, notice the downright bizarre passage of time between Act 1 and Act 2. The next day supposedly arrives, but memory is incredibly unstable here. The characters barely even remember yesterday. Time feels totally circular, not linear. Just look at the changes. That bear tree we mentioned, it suddenly sprouts leaves, suggesting time has passed, or maybe offering a tiny hint of ambiguous renewal. And look at Pazzo and Lucky. Their power dynamic completely flips. Pazzo, who was so domineering yesterday, is suddenly blind and entirely dependent. Lucky is now completely mute. This shows how incredibly fast human conditions can decay and change. proving that all authority is just temporary. Yet, despite these dramatic physical shifts, the foundational human paralysis remains identically, tragically stuck. They wait. A boy shows up to say Godot will come tomorrow, and they just continue to wait. And this leads us perfectly to an impossibly simple two-step sequence. Step 1, decide to leave. Step 2, do not move. At the end of both acts, Vladimir and Estragon agree to finally leave the tree. The dialogue literally says, let's go, but the stage directions explicitly, famously state, they do not move. And this happens twice. It perfectly dramatizes Beckett's vision of human paralysis. It's a decision completely devoid of action. They're so trapped in this ritual of waiting, so bogged down by the sheer monotony of their existence, that life has just evolved into a repetitive loop rather than an actual journey of progress. Let's transition to Section 3, Symbols of the Absurd, and talk about metaphors of dread.
Let's look at the incredibly limited props they actually have available on stage. First, the tree. It's a totally ambiguous symbol. It could mean life, death, maybe crucifixion, or, like when it sprouts those leaves, possible renewal. Then there's the road. That's your classic metaphor for life's journey, except here it leads absolutely nowhere. Finally, the boots and hats. Throughout the whole play, the characters constantly handle, swap, and just fiddle with these trivial items. Why? Because they are material distractions. They represent human routine. The characters are literally using these physical distractions to fill the dead air and survive the unbearable act of waiting. They are desperate to avoid confronting the terrifying reality of their own existence.
Naturally, we have to address the elephant in the room. Who exactly is this mysterious figure they believe will finally complete their lives? Godot is easily the most debated symbol in the entire history of modern drama. Over the years, audiences and scholars have interpreted him as representing God, salvation, death, a sense of purpose, ultimate meaning, an authority figure, or honestly, just an illusion. Because the dialogue in the play constantly repeats itself, contradicts itself, and goes absolutely nowhere, language itself completely fails to give us any certainty about his true identity.
And this brilliantly leads us to a fantastic quote directly from the playwright himself. Samuel Beckett famously said, "If I knew who Godot was, I would have said so." He absolutely, categorically refused to define him. He refused to hand the audience a comforting, neat little explanation. And that right there proves that the unresolved ambiguity is the intentional, brilliant core of the entire narrative. Godot isn't necessarily a specific person. Godot symbolizes whatever elusive thing we individually believe will finally give our lives meaning. By leaving it totally undefined, Beckett forces us to actually experience the waiting itself, rather than just spoon-feeding us a convenient answer.
Okay, let's wrap things up with Section 4, Why We Keep Waiting and How Hope Survives.
So you might be wondering, why does a story about meaningless waiting, failing language, and deep existential dread resonate so incredibly deeply with us today? Well, a crucial piece of that puzzle is the messenger of hope. Right at the end of each act, this young boy appears. He acts as a messenger, delivering the exact same news both times. Godot will not come today, but he will surely come tomorrow. This is such a vital moment. The arrival of the boy postpones their fulfillment, yes, but crucially, it keeps their hope alive. It shows us that despite the existential dread, despite the suffering and the utter meaninglessness of it all, hope somehow survives. It's a completely irrational hope for sure, but it's also deeply tragic and honestly profoundly beautiful. It's the one thing that stops them from just walking away from that tree.
Which brings us to a pretty stark reality: zero resolutions. The play famously ends exactly where it began. The ending is totally, completely open. We never find out who Godot actually is, we don't know if he'll ever show up, and we still don't really know why they don't just leave. But you know what? That circularity is the entire point. Beckett is forcing the audience to confront a terrifying what if. What if life itself is just this? Waiting, repeating, hoping, all without a single shred of certainty. He's giving us raw experience instead of a prepackaged explanation, proving that human beings will just keep continuing on, even when they don't understand life or have any clue what comes next.
Ultimately, Beckett leaves us hanging with this tragic yet really beautiful truth about human persistence. We just keep going. And that persistence itself might just be the very thing that makes us fundamentally human. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to look inward for a second and ask yourself honestly, what elusive thing are you waiting for to finally begin your life? What is your Godot?